Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story.
Subscribe, like, and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
At Thanksgiving dinner, just as the cranberry sauce hit the table, my dad raised a glass and said, "We've decided Kyle will inherit the company. He's earned it more than anyone else." The silence after that? It was louder than any screaming match we'd ever had. My fork hung midair, just an inch above the mashed potatoes, hand frozen like I'd forgotten how muscles work. I looked around the table, half expecting someone to laugh, to say it was a joke, maybe one of those weird holiday pranks my dad used to pull when we were kids. But nobody laughed. Not Mom, not Kyle, not my Uncle Jim, who always had something smart to say. They just nodded, some slowly, some already chewing turkey like nothing world-altering had just been said. My name's Nate, by the way. Nathaniel Dean Rourke, named after my grandfather who started the family business with one beat-up truck and a garage full of rusted tools. Rourke Contracting. Maybe you've seen the signs if you've driven through southern Ohio. My dad, Richard, grew it into something huge. Now the trucks are new, the contracts are government level, and the company clears more in 1/4 than my granddad ever saw in his lifetime. For the longest time, I thought I'd be the one to carry that legacy. Hell, I practically lived inside that company for 10 years, late nights, early mornings, vacations canceled, relationships torched. But here I was, watching it all handed off like a second helping of stuffing, and it wasn't going to me. It was going to Kyle. Now, Kyle's my younger brother by 4 years. We shared a bedroom until I left for college. He used to cry every night when the lights went out, and I'd stay up whispering dumb stories to calm him down. I taught him how to tie a tie and lie to Mom about breaking the garage window. But somewhere along the way, that turned into him always getting the benefit of the doubt. Every mistake of his was a misunderstanding, while mine were character flaws. I was the one who needed to grow up. He was just going through a phase. Kyle had that golden aura around him since high school, varsity athlete, prom king, dad's golf buddy by junior year. He joined the business right after college and shot up the ranks like a firework. People said he had natural leadership, but I knew what that meant. It meant he smiled in meetings and agreed with Dad on everything. It meant he played the game I refused to play. I pushed back. I questioned budgets, flagged missing funds, refused to let my father run the business like a medieval kingdom. And that, apparently, had cost me everything. The rest of the table went back to eating like nothing seismic had just cracked the floor open. My cousin Amber passed the gravy like she hadn't just heard her uncle effectively cut one of his sons out of the will. Mom smiled and offered more rolls. Rolls. I watched her eyes avoid mine. That was the hardest part, the way she looked down like maybe I deserved this, and just didn't know it yet. I cleared my throat, not sure what I was going to say, if anything. I knew if I exploded, if I let the years of frustration and confusion and bitterness pour out in one Thanksgiving monologue, they'd all say I was proving their point. That I was the problem. That I was unstable, ungrateful, emotional. So I just nodded slowly, looked my father dead in the eye, and said, "Thank you for being honest." But inside me, something had already snapped. It wasn't loud. It didn't make a scene. But it was real. It was final. Something deep and unspoken, the kind of thing that builds in a man for decades, just quietly gave out. I kept eating like everyone else, but my food might as well have been cardboard. My hands were steady, but my jaw clenched tight with every fake smile I forced when someone made small talk. I answered questions about work like I wasn't on the verge of shattering a decades-long family legacy out of spite, or maybe justice. Hell, I wasn't sure which anymore. Kyle leaned over mid-meal, elbow on the table like always, and said under his breath, "Let's not make this a thing, Nate. It's just business. Just business." The phrase sat in my chest like a brick. He didn't mean it cruelly, at least, not in the obvious way. No smirk, no raised eyebrow. But he knew. He knew exactly what it meant. That I'd been cut out, pushed aside, like a busted cog in the machine my grandfather built. That the seat I'd earned through blood and sweat and compromise had been quietly moved, and mine was now at the far end of the table, far enough that my opinion didn't matter anymore. I looked around again and realized that, in their eyes, the decision had already been made years ago. This wasn't the moment I got disinherited. This was the moment I was told. The planning, the shifting of roles, the signing of documents behind closed doors, it had all already happened. I'd just been invited to dinner to watch it all go down with cranberry sauce on the side. And you know what? That was the moment I decided I wasn't going to let them write me out of the story like that. If they wanted Kyle to have it all, then they'd better be ready to fight for it in court. Because while they were quietly rewriting the future behind my back, I'd been quietly keeping notes. And I wasn't just going to eat turkey and smile while they handed him the kingdom. They wanted quiet. I was going to give them fireworks. It's funny how the cracks in a family don't always start with a scream. Sometimes they begin with a shrug, a document left unsigned, a phone call unreturned, or a line in a spreadsheet that doesn't quite add up. That was 5 years ago when I was still walking into the office every morning thinking I was building something with my name on it, something my future kids would be proud of, even if I didn't have any yet. I wore the damn company name on my chest like a badge, Rourke contracting embroidered in navy thread over my heart, right beside a million missed meals, postponed honeymoons, and skipped Sunday barbecues. I showed up every day, even when I didn't want to. Especially when I didn't want to. And I believed, stupidly, that loyalty was going to be enough. The first time I noticed the discrepancy, I didn't even think of Kyle. My head went straight to the accounting software, blamed the software first, then maybe a clerical error. It was a property purchase listed under a shell company name, drawn straight from one of our commercial development accounts, except that property had nothing to do with any of our jobs and no paper trail to back it up. A 4-unit condo in Cincinnati, sleek, overpriced, and absolutely unrelated to our usual contracts. I flagged it, brought it up with Brenda in accounts, who shrugged and said, "That's above my pay grade, Nate." So I brought it to Dad. He didn't even let me finish before waving his hand like I was interrupting a golf swing. "Don't worry about it," he said, not even looking up from his laptop. "That's just some internal allocation Kyle's handling." It's nothing. Nothing. It was always nothing when it was Kyle. When I made a mistake, it was a lesson in professionalism, a leadership deficit, a warning in a closed-door meeting with Dad staring me down over his glasses like I'd crashed a company truck. When Kyle slipped, it was learning. Growth. Just part of the business. I let it slide that time. But I kept a copy. I printed the spreadsheet, saved a backup on a hard drive I kept at home. Just a gut feeling. Something that whispered, "You're going to need this." And I did. Because the second time, it wasn't a property, it was a supplier invoice. Padded labor hours billed to a subcontractor that didn't exist. Again, nothing huge, but enough to set off alarm bells. Kyle had signed off on it himself, and when I brought it up at the next ops meeting, Dad gave me this look, not angry, just tired, and said, "Nate, maybe you should focus on managing your own division and leave the numbers to me and Kyle." Leave the numbers. Right. I left more than the numbers. I left the company 6 weeks later. I typed up a formal resignation, handed it to my father on a Tuesday morning, and he barely blinked. He didn't fight it. He didn't even ask why. Just said, "That's probably for the best. You've seemed restless lately." Like I was a college kid switching majors, not the damn COO walking away from 10 years of blood and sweat. And Mom? She stood at the door that night, arms folded, face blank, and said, "You know your father doesn't need this stress right now." That was the first time I realized they had picked their side. Not just in that moment, but a long time ago. Somewhere along the line, they decided Kyle was the one to bet on. Maybe because he was easier. Maybe because he smiled at the right time. Or maybe because he reminded them of themselves in the ways I didn't. I stopped being the son who built things and became the son who threatened to tear things down. Even if I hadn't done it yet, the fact that I could made me dangerous. What would you do if your own family looked you in the eye and said, "You just don't deserve it"? Would you walk away quietly, or would you do what I did? After I left, Kyle took my office. Not literally, I mean, I'm sure he had it repainted, made it his own, probably hung one of those framed motivational quotes like, "Success is earned, not given." But in every practical sense, he slipped into my role like it had been tailored for him. Projects I started were now his. Clients I brought in were now on his Christmas list. And no one blinked. No one questioned it. It was like I'd never been there. But I didn't go quietly. Not really. Every couple of weeks, I'd get a phone call from someone inside, Brenda, or George from logistics, or my old project manager Lisa. Just little comments. "Hey, did you hear about that warehouse purchase in Dayton? Bit of an overreach, huh? Or Kyle's new client's a bit shady, but your dad's all in." I'd nod, listen, and write everything down. I wasn't building a case back then. Not officially. I just couldn't stop looking. Couldn't let it go. Some nights I'd sit in my apartment, 2 fingers of bourbon in a glass, going over old emails like they were chapters in a mystery novel. And the more I read, the more I realized I hadn't been paranoid. I'd been right. It wasn't just one thing. It was a pattern. Misreported revenue, fictitious vendors, personal expenses disguised as company travel. Kyle was siphoning value from the business, slowly but confidently, like someone who knew no one would call him on it. And Dad let him. Whether out of blindness or willful ignorance, he let him. And I guess that's when the resentment started to curdle into something heavier, not just frustration, but betrayal. They didn't just cut me out. They knew what he was doing and still chose him. I started printing things, saving files, creating backups of backups. Not because I was ready to go to war yet, but because I knew someday I might have to. Because if they ever crossed the line again, if they ever came for me with clean hands and dirty hearts, I wanted to be ready. And when Dad stood at that table on that cold Thanksgiving afternoon and handed my life to Kyle in a single sentence, I realized that moment had finally arrived. Thanksgiving always had that strange weight to it in our family, not just because of the turkey or the tradition, but because it was one of the few days when every branch of the tree showed up and pretended, with varying degrees of effort, that we were still a tight-knit clan. The year before the announcement, the Thanksgiving before everything went nuclear, I had already started to see the cracks widening between me and the rest of them, especially Kyle. The tension wasn't loud or obvious, but it was in every glance that lasted a second too long, every carefully phrased sentence, every joke that landed a little too hard for comfort. I showed up that year with a bottle of bourbon and a polite smile, the kind you practice in the car mirror when you know you're walking into enemy territory disguised as a family home. My parents greeted me like they were trying out for a play about functional families, warm, scripted, hollow. My mother hugged me tight enough to feel like a performance, while my father just clapped me on the back like I was a client they hadn't seen since last quarter. Kyle was already there, of course, laughing with my cousin Eli in the den, holding a beer like he hadn't stolen 5 figures from the company and buried it under Dad's protection. When I walked into the room, he didn't flinch, didn't shift, didn't show even the smallest hint that my presence meant anything other than a necessary evil. He stood up, extended his hand like we were business associates, and gave me a grin that was just wide enough to read as condescending if you knew him like I did. "Nate," he said, "glad you could make it this year." That year. Like I'd missed one not because I was busy, but because I'd been too disgusted to sit across from him without saying something I couldn't take back. The dinner itself was a parade of distractions, sweet potatoes, polite laughter, stories about vacations and promotions, and Eli's new girlfriend who everyone liked too fast. I kept one eye on Kyle the entire time. He was calm, smooth, answering questions with the ease of a politician who's already paid off the press. But when our eyes met across the table, even for a second, the mask slipped just for me. He knew I was watching him, and he wanted me to see how comfortable he'd become in my place. Later that evening, after the pie was served and most of the family had migrated to the living room for football and half-hearted card games, I cornered him in the hallway near the laundry room, where the noise was muffled and the lights didn't flatter either of us. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse. I just looked him dead in the eye and said, "You ever lose sleep over it?" He didn't even ask what it was. That's how I knew he was guilty. He leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, like this was just another conversation he'd win by being unbothered. "What exactly am I supposed to feel guilty about, Nate?" he asked, tone perfectly measured, smile slow and practiced. "Running the business better than you did?" "You know what you did," I said, and for a second, just a split second, I saw his face harden, the eyes shift, like he was deciding how honest he could afford to be with me. Then he smiled again, that same smug twist of the mouth he used when we were kids, and he got away with something. "What I know," he said, "is that Dad trusts me. And if you had a problem with that, maybe you should have been better at your job." That was it. That was the moment I decided I wasn't going to just stew in resentment or wait for some miraculous apology that would never come. I nodded, turned around, walked back into the dining room, and for the rest of the evening, I smiled. I smiled at every joke, played along with every game of cards, and even helped clean up the dishes like nothing was boiling inside me. Because I had decided that if they wanted to play dirty, I'd play smart. If they wanted to pretend everything was fine, I'd pretend harder, all while getting ready to burn their little empire down, legally and cleanly. The next morning, I made 3 calls, one to a lawyer I knew from college, one to a forensic accountant I'd met at a construction industry conference, and one to myself in the bathroom mirror, promising I wouldn't let them get away with this. I didn't tell anyone, not my friends, not my cousins, not even Lisa, my ex, who still checked in every couple months like she was waiting for me to admit I missed her. I needed this to be silent, strategic, and sharp. The forensic guy, Mark, older, smart, dry as toast, looked through what I had and said, "This isn't just sloppy, it's intentional. They're burying personal assets under project expenses and creating shell vendors to funnel cash. This isn't negligence, it's fraud." I didn't flinch when he said it. I already knew. But hearing it confirmed by someone who had no horse in the race lit something in me I hadn't felt in a long time, clarity. Not rage, not sadness, not that hollow ache of betrayal. Just purpose. So I spent the next few months gathering more. Quietly requesting public records, pulling down digital backups from old email servers, finding paper trails they thought they'd buried under years of complacency. Kyle thought I was licking my wounds somewhere. Dad thought I'd moved on. Mom probably hoped I'd finally found peace. What I was doing, though, was preparing. That second Thanksgiving was their last chance to make it right. To come clean, to apologize, to offer me even a sliver of the respect I'd earned through years of building that business. But instead, Kyle smirked and my father looked the other way. So I did what I had to do. I started the countdown. It's a strange kind of heartbreak when the truth finally confirms your worst suspicions, when the smoke turns out to be fire and you're the only one choking on it because everyone else's lungs got used to the smoke years ago. I remember the day the final piece fell into place like it happened an hour ago, not because it was dramatic or loud, but because it was quiet, surgical, clean in a way that betrayal almost never is. It was a Wednesday afternoon in late October when Mark, my forensic accountant, sent me a file labeled simply Mason Creek Holdings and a 3-line email that changed everything. He'd been digging through vendor payments and flagged a recurring invoice labeled as Site Services Consulting, vague enough to pass the sniff test, but consistent enough to raise a brow. The payments were going to a holding company that didn't show up in any real vendor registry, at least not one tied to construction or logistics. But when Mark traced the ownership, it looped back to a private trust, and that trust was registered in Kyle's name. Mason Creek Holdings wasn't a vendor. It was a shell company. And the kicker? It owned a handful of high-end rental properties just outside Columbus, properties I knew for a fact had never passed through our development schedule. Mark called me an hour later, calm as ever. It's not just unethical, he said, it's prosecutable. He's been laundering company funds into personal real estate under Dad's signature. And from what I can see, Richard didn't just miss it, he approved the disbursements directly. There are signatures. Your father knew. That's when the air went out of the room. That's when the whole damn foundation cracked beneath me, because somewhere deep down, despite everything, despite the slights, the silence, the favoritism, I still believed my dad was just blind, not complicit. I thought maybe he was protecting Kyle out of delusion or fatherly denial. But no, the old man had co-signed the betrayal. He had initialed every lie. And suddenly, all those years ago when money had gone missing and I'd been blamed for mismanaging overhead, it snapped into focus. The spreadsheets. The audits. The sit-down meetings where I had to explain why a quarter didn't hit projections. I wasn't the one bleeding the company dry. I was the scapegoat. Kyle had been doing it all along and Dad had let him. Probably because it was easier than facing what his golden boy had become. So I did something I hadn't done in a long time. I got in my car and drove straight to the house, the old house, the one they'd lived in for 30-plus years with the same god-awful beige siding and that stone walkway Dad swore he'd redo every spring but never did. Mom answered the door, still wearing her afternoon cardigan like it was armor, and gave me a cautious smile that instantly curdled when she saw my face. "He's in his study," she said, stepping aside but not really inviting me in. I didn't sit. I didn't take off my coat. I walked straight into Dad's study and dropped a stack of printed documents on his desk with a calmness that surprised even me. "You want to tell me what this is?" I asked, voice low, steady, the kind you use when there's nothing left to argue about. He looked at the papers, then up at me, then back down like if he just stared long enough, they might disappear. After a pause that felt like someone hit the mute button on the world, he said, "Where did you get this?" "Where doesn't matter," I said. "Why matters? Why would you let him steal from the company? From your own people?" "From me." He didn't deny it. That was the worst part. He didn't jump up and yell or pretend I was crazy. He just took a breath and said, "You always had a chip on your shoulder, Nate. You always needed to be right. Kyle, he's different. He knows how to lead without burning bridges." That's when Mom came in, eyes darting between us like she'd walked into a room full of gasoline and lit matches. "Don't do this," she said. "Not now. Not again." And I said something I'd been biting down for years. "You always defend him. Always. No matter what he does." Mom's voice cracked, but not in sadness, in anger. "Because he doesn't act like the whole world owes him something. Because he doesn't make every disagreement into a betrayal." There it was. The family verdict. I wasn't disinherited at the dinner table. I'd been sentenced years ago for the crime of not being Kyle. I left that house without another word. I didn't slam the door. I didn't yell. I didn't even cry. I drove home, opened my laptop, and called my attorney. I told her to begin filing. Fraud, embezzlement, breach of fiduciary duty. And I told her we weren't just going after Kyle, we were naming my father too. Because if they wanted to tie their futures to his decisions, they could sink with him. This wasn't revenge. This was justice wrapped in cold, clean paperwork. It was the only language they'd chosen to understand. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with the lawsuit draft spread out like a final exam. 43 pages of allegations, financials, exhibits, and demands. Every page a chapter in the story they tried to erase me from. Every paragraph a counterpunch to a decade of being told to let it go for the sake of peace. I picked up a pen and signed the last page. And that's when I knew. There was no going back. Not now. Not ever. It was the kind of Thanksgiving afternoon where everything looked just right on the surface. The turkey was golden and steaming, the silverware clinked politely against heirloom plates, and the laughter around the table sounded warm if you didn't listen too hard. But underneath the polite gestures and too tight smiles, there was something humming, something invisible but violent, like a wire stretched to its absolute limit. I'd been sitting at that table for nearly 40 minutes, carving bits of white meat onto my plate while my brother held court at the head of the table like he'd been elected family king and no one had bothered to vote. He was in rare form that day, fake modesty dripping from every word, brushing off compliments with the kind of humility that only ever hides arrogance. "I just feel blessed," Kyle said with a slow nod, fingers laced over his plate like a man giving a sermon. "To be in a position to carry on the Rourke name. Not just in business, but in responsibility. It's not about profit, it's about legacy." Legacy. He said it like he hadn't funneled thousands into a shell company to pad his real estate portfolio. Like he hadn't been siphoning from the business that our grandfather built one paycheck at a time, while Dad smiled and initialed the bottom of every lie. He looked down the table at our aunts, uncles, and cousins, letting that word linger like he'd just said something holy. I sat still, watching him, hearing the buzz in my ears that always came when I knew I was about to do something that couldn't be undone. I waited, silent and still, because I wanted to give them one last chance to choke on the truth before I force-fed it to them. The table stretched long, wider than it used to be, now pushed together with 2 extra leaves Dad had pulled from the garage, dusted off just for the occasion. There were 20 people around that table, cousins, in-laws, old neighbors who never missed a holiday. Everyone smiling, sipping, chewing, waiting for the main event. And then it came. My father stood up at the far end of the table, wine glass in hand, and with a voice that tried to sound ceremonial but came out businesslike, said, "We just wanted to say something, to share something, I suppose, with everyone here." The room quieted the way only a Rourke gathering ever did, when they knew Dad was about to talk and they didn't want to miss their cue to applaud. He looked at my mother, who gave him a little nod, and then he said it. "After much thought, your mother and I have decided that the company, Rourke Contracting, the properties, the assets, will be left solely to Kyle. He's earned it more than anyone. He's the future of this family business, and we're proud to say that we trust him to carry it forward." He smiled. My mother nodded. Kyle gave a modest shrug, eyes cast downward like a child pretending he didn't know he was getting a bike for Christmas. Around the table, a few people clapped. A few looked awkwardly at their plates. My cousin Amber glanced at me, then quickly looked away, chewing slowly like she didn't want to get involved. I stood up. No one noticed at first. The conversation buzzed around the edges, like static threatening to return. I cleared my throat once softly and said, "Thanks for sharing that." The room fell quiet again. I could feel every eye turn to me, waiting for a toast or a tantrum. I reached down into my leather bag and pulled out a stack of thick, sealed envelopes. One by one, I walked around the table and handed them out, not fast, not dramatic, just steady, deliberate. My uncle tried to joke. "What's this?" Early Christmas cards, but the joke died when he saw my face. Inside those envelopes was the lawsuit, 43 pages of allegations, financial breakdowns, email records, wire transfers, and notarized affidavits. It was the whole ugly truth printed on fine legal paper with my name at the top as plaintiff and Kyle's name, along with my father's listed as defendants. I'd made sure every relative got a copy. I wanted them to know before the newspapers did. I wanted them to see what Kyle really did with the so-called legacy. The first person to react was Kyle. He opened his envelope with the care of a man expecting a love letter, and by the time he hit the second page, his face changed. Not rage. Not confusion. No, it was fear dressed up as disbelief. He looked at me across the table and said, "You've got to be ****ing kidding me." And then, almost immediately, he caught himself and looked toward our parents like a teenager hoping someone else would take the wheel. Dad was already flipping through the pages, jaw clenched, glasses halfway down his nose, trying to keep his voice even. "You blindsided us," he said, quieter than I expected. "On Thanksgiving." "This wasn't a decision made lightly," I said. "But you didn't leave me any choice." Mom stood up, not bothering with her envelope. "This is petty, Nathan. This is small. If you think this gets you anything, you're more lost than I thought. I looked at her for a long moment, then said, I don't want anything. I want what's mine. Then the yelling started. Kyle slammed his hand down on the table, knocking over a wine glass that shattered and spilled across the tablecloth. Someone shouted. Someone else tried to stand up and slipped on a napkin. My aunt gasped, and a fork clattered onto the hardwood floor. My cousin Eli muttered something about always knew that kid was shady, and my mother cried out that I was tearing the family apart. But it wasn't me who did that. That table broke long before I stood up. All I did was show them the cracks. After the chaos cracked open that Thanksgiving table like dry wood, the silence that followed felt even louder than the yelling had. People didn't go back to their meals. No one reached for seconds or tried to change the subject with a laugh. The wine stain bled slowly across the ivory tablecloth like a wound that wouldn't stop spreading, and in that moment, I could see every single person doing the math in their heads, calculating loyalties, questioning memories, wondering how long this had been coming and why none of them saw it. Or maybe they had. Maybe they had seen it, but like most people do with family dysfunction, they chose not to ask questions that might demand uncomfortable answers. Kyle stood there with his mouth half open and his jaw tight like a man who'd been preparing for a punch, but not the kind that came from a piece of paper. My mother, still standing at her chair, finally found her voice, and when she did, it hit harder than I expected, not because of what she said, but because of how much of it she clearly believed. You were always jealous, she said, her voice cracking not from tears, but from bitterness. Even when you were little, you couldn't stand that he got more attention. You hated that he made people laugh, that he didn't have to try so hard. You held on to that your whole life, Nathan, and now you think this is justice? It's not. It's punishment. And it's ugly. I didn't respond right away. I was watching her, watching how certain she looked in her anger, how tightly she clung to the idea that I was the problem, because the alternative, that Kyle had fooled them all, was too much for her to stomach. Behind her, Kyle scoffed under his breath and finally spoke, and what came out of his mouth wasn't shock or shame. It was venom. You want the truth, he said, loud enough for the whole table to hear, not caring that his voice was shaking or that his face had turned a deep, frustrated red. You've always acted like the company was yours just because you worked harder. Newsflash, Nate. No one gives a damn how many hours you put in if nobody likes you. You were bitter when you were there, and you were bitter when you left. You think Dad didn't see that? You think the board didn't see that? People don't follow someone just because they're right, they follow someone who knows how to lead. The words stung, not because they were true, but because they were rehearsed. They were the kind of things you practice in your head late at night, waiting for the moment you can finally unleash them. He had been waiting years to say this, to strip me down in front of the family, and now that the moment was here, he didn't care who else got hurt in the process. I wanted to hit him. Not physically, but verbally. I wanted to go for the throat, to call him out for every lie, every backroom deal, every time he smiled in someone's face and took something from them behind their back. But I didn't, because it wouldn't have mattered. Not right then. The room was already poisoned, the sides already drawn. I'd brought the truth, and the only thing people hate more than a liar is the person who exposes the lie at dinner. I walked out of the dining room, past the kitchen, down the hallway lined with old family photos, all those frozen memories of smiles and birthdays and matching sweaters, and into the garage, where it was cold and quiet, and smelled like old paint and gasoline. I stood there with my hands in my pockets and my heart pounding in my throat, trying to decide if what I felt was vindication or regret. A few minutes later, my Aunt Carol came out, the only one who didn't owe loyalty to either side. She'd married into the family back in the 80s, and somehow she always managed to stay out of the inner drama while seeing more than anyone gave her credit for. She didn't say anything at first, just leaned against the workbench, arms folded, her breath visible in the cold air. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet, but it landed like a hammer. "You're not wrong, Nate," she said. but you're not right either. I turned toward her, not angry, just tired. So which is it then? Am I the villain or the victim? She gave a half smile, sad and knowing. That's the problem with family, she said. No one's just one thing. And she was right. Because as much as I wanted to tell myself this was about justice, there was a part of me that wanted them to hurt the way I had, to feel the shame and exclusion I'd swallowed year after year. It wasn't just about the company. It was about every Thanksgiving I showed up knowing I'd get a smaller portion of love, every family photo where I stood one step behind Kyle, every time my parents called to check on him and forgot I existed for weeks at a time. So yeah, maybe there was jealousy in it. Maybe there was spite. But there was also truth. And I wasn't going to apologize for finally dragging that truth into the light, no matter how messy it got. Out in the garage, I sat on Dad's old toolbox and stared at the shelves lined with screws and nails and half-used paint cans, and I thought about how many things in that house had been patched over instead of properly fixed. How many cracks they ignored, because looking at them too closely meant admitting the whole place might not be as solid as it looked. They'd called me bitter. But maybe bitterness is just the taste truth leaves behind when no one wants to swallow it. The first call from my lawyer came early on a Monday, her voice crisp and matter-of-fact like always, but this time there was a hesitation buried beneath the professionalism, the kind that tells you things are about to get messier than you'd planned for. Their counsel filed a motion this morning, she said, and I could hear her clicking through documents as she spoke. They've hired a firm out of Chicago. Serious people. Expensive people. I nodded silently even though she couldn't see me, staring out my kitchen window at the dying leaves barely clinging to the trees. The storm was officially here. My parents didn't call. Not a word. No email, no text, no veiled attempt to reach me through a cousin or family friend. They went straight into defense mode, like a company closing ranks after a breach, which, I guess, is exactly what it was. The business was bleeding internally, and instead of treating the wound, they'd chosen to sue the scalpel. My brother, of course, had already taken the reins, not just legally, but in public. He made statements to the board. He reassured staff. He painted himself as the protector of the company, the victim of a misguided and painful family dispute. The phrase made it into a memo. I read it 3 times before laughing hard enough to choke on my coffee. Then came the press. Not the front page of the New York Times, but local media, business blogs, trade publications, and the kind of Ohio news sites that still list church bake sales in their events calendar. A whistleblower claim from a former executive. Allegations of fraud. Internal conflict between heirs. One reporter got a hold of the civil filing and published excerpts, including the part where I accused Kyle of using company funds to acquire personal property through a trust registered under a false business name. Suddenly, the story wasn't just a private family issue, it was a public scandal. Clients started to pull out. 2 regional contracts went quiet. Emails went unanswered. A longtime supplier put a hold on deliveries, and the whispers started. Everyone in our little business circle knew the Rourkes. We'd built a reputation on handshakes and second chances, on 3 generations of honest work that people wanted to believe in. Now that reputation was on fire, and the only ones holding the matches were the same ones smiling for the annual Christmas card. That's when Kyle called me. I hadn't heard his voice since the night everything exploded at the dinner table, but he sounded calm, too calm, the way a man sounds when he knows he's losing but still thinks he can buy his way back to the top. Look, he said, we can fix this. No press, no depositions, no damage to the brand. He even had the nerve to call it the brand, like it was just a logo and not the bones of our family tree. We'll offer you a severance package, he continued, something generous. You walk away with a non-disclosure, we amend the will quietly, and everyone moves on. I let the silence stretch until he had to speak again. Nate? I'm not interested in your peace offering, I said, slowly and clearly, so he wouldn't mistake my resolve for hesitation. This isn't about money anymore. It's about truth. something you wouldn't recognize if it kicked in your door. He laughed once, short and sharp. Jesus, you sound like a martyr. I don't care what I sound like. I care what I leave behind. That was the last thing I said before I hung up. 2 days later, I got a call from my Aunt Carol, the same one who'd found me in the garage that night, and this time, her voice wasn't steady. "It's your dad," she said. "Mild heart attack. They've got him at St. Vincent's. You should come." I didn't race there. I didn't panic or pray or feel some rush of guilt tear through my chest like people always say happens in the movies. I got in my car. I drove under gray skies. I parked at the far end of the hospital lot and walked in like I was heading to a routine checkup. And when I stepped into the waiting room, every head turned. Mom sat stiffly by the coffee machine, her cardigan wrinkled and her expression brittle with judgment. Kyle leaned against the wall with his arms crossed, looking like a man waiting for someone to blame. When his eyes met mine, they didn't say, "Thank you for coming." They said, "This is your fault." No one said it out loud at first, but the air was thick with accusation. It was my lawsuit. My betrayal. My fault for driving a wedge so deep it cracked our father's chest open. Never mind the years of deceit, the money that vanished, the trust that Kyle broke every time he signed another fake invoice. No, none of that mattered now. There was a hospital bed involved, and in their eyes, I might as well have wheeled him and myself. I didn't argue. I didn't explain. I just nodded and walked down the corridor, not to his room, but past it, past the nurses, past the doors marked authorized personnel only, and into the hospital cafeteria, where the smell of stale coffee and reheated soup filled the air like a fog of fatigue and forgotten time. I sat at a corner table and stared at a vending machine for 20 minutes. And for the first time since this whole thing started, I didn't feel angry. I didn't feel proud. I didn't feel anything close to victory. I just felt empty. Like I'd finally proven what needed to be proven and still hadn't filled the hole they left in me years ago when they decided who mattered and who didn't. I thought about legacy. About what that word really means when all the money and buildings and titles are stripped away. I thought about coffins and courtrooms and how damn close they'd gotten to each other in my life. And I sat there alone, wondering if any of this had been worth it and not knowing the answer. The lawyer's voice was as calm as it was final, her words unfolding slowly across the speakerphone like she knew they'd been rehearsed 1,000 times already, and I was just the last one left to be informed. "Your name hasn't been part of the estate plan for nearly 6 years, Nathan," she said, almost kindly, as if the softness would somehow make it sting less. "The revision was made shortly after your departure from the company, and the clause was signed, notarized, and witnessed at the time. It was legal, clean, and, according to your parents, mutual." Mutual. That word rattled around in my skull for a long second like a coin dropped into a metal can, loud, hollow, and absurd. There had been nothing mutual about it. They'd cut me out like a tumor and never told me the operation even happened. While I was still showing up for birthdays, buying them Christmas gifts, calling every other Sunday and pretending like the air wasn't already poisoned, they had already written me out of the family script. My name hadn't just been left off the will, it had been erased. And I had been too blind or too loyal or maybe just too stubborn to notice. The final court date landed on a gray, wet Tuesday, one of those Ohio mornings where the clouds feel like they're sitting just a few feet above your head, pressing everything down, flattening the horizon. I wore a black suit and didn't bring anyone with me. No family, no friends. Just me, my attorney, and a quiet kind of fury that had settled into something more like resolve. The judge was efficient and uninterested in theatrics. He reviewed the evidence, accepted the discovery documents, acknowledged the history of embezzlement, and ultimately ruled in my favor. A partial settlement, enough to prove misconduct and extract compensation, but not enough to restore what had been taken in spirit. I didn't smile. I didn't even nod. Winning had always been a relative term in this kind of war. The company, what was left of it, was bleeding. Clients had backed out in droves, contracts dissolved, and suppliers started whispering that Rourke Contracting was no longer stable. What took 3 generations to build had been reduced to a cautionary tale in under 18 months. Carl stepped down from his position 2 weeks after the ruling, citing stress and family matters, but everyone knew the truth. The board had forced it, and even Dad couldn't save him this time. They brought in a restructuring firm, laid off half the administrative team, and quietly tried to sell off some of the property assets to stay afloat. No press release. No farewell party. Just a hollow shell with the same logo and none of the soul. As for my parents, they didn't call. Not after the verdict. Not when Kyle resigned. Not even when news broke that I had donated part of the settlement to a legal aid fund for small business fraud victims. They went no contact, silently and with full intention. No letters. No emails. No explanation beyond their absence. And in a way, that was the clearest message they ever sent me. Not the words they said around holiday tables, not the speeches about legacy or trust, just the sound of the phone never ringing again. So here I am. It's Thanksgiving again. This time, there's no full house, no 20-person table, no football blaring in the other room. Just me in a quiet rented cabin with a small turkey breast in the oven and a single plate set on the table. No wine, no candles. Just a man and his silence. And the folder. The folder's an old leather one, worn at the corners, filled with yellowed photos from childhood, me and Kyle in matching pajamas, me on a job site with Dad when I was 12, Mom holding a birthday cake while I grinned with frosting on my nose. I flipped through them slowly, not with bitterness, not with nostalgia, but with the kind of detached clarity that only comes when you've walked through the fire and made it out the other side with scars you can finally look at without flinching. They said I didn't deserve it. Maybe they were right. Maybe I was too stubborn, too proud, too unwilling to play the game the way they wanted it played. Maybe I was too caught up in fairness to see that family businesses aren't run on justice, they're run on loyalty, silence, and hierarchy. Maybe I was always the difficult one. But I wasn't going to let them rewrite the story while I was still in it. I set the photos aside and eat my meal in peace. No arguments, no fake toasts, no pretending everything's fine. Just quiet. Real quiet. The kind that doesn't hide anything beneath it. And maybe that's all I ever wanted. Not the company. Not the money. Just the truth on the record, with my name still attached. The kind of truth you can pass down, even if you've got no one left to hand it to.